So if we've gone through these transitionary periods now, we've had commodity money, we had the gold standard, Bretton Woods, the petrodollar system. We're heading into this kind of digitization of money, which we've talked about and you talk about in the article. For you, is this now an inevitable change?
Well, I think the digitization of money is inevitable. And then the question is which type becomes dominant, right? Is Bitcoin strong enough to kind of push back on government control over it? Or does it run into a number of shortcomings and governments are able to make their CBDCs rather dominant? And I err towards Bitcoin being successful long term. I think it has the properties of it's hard enough. It checks off a number of boxes, and even the boxes it doesn't check off are within sight of being able to be checked off as technology improves and as it gets just more widely held and it becomes better. And so I think longer term, Bitcoin is you can call it the fastest horse in the race. It's I think the best thing to bet on, even though, for most people, I wouldn't recommend 100% allocation to Bitcoin, but I think it's something that's silly not to have any of at this point. I think in 2022, if you have zero Bitcoin, I think the person has to probably spend more time looking into what that is.
Are you listening, Peter Schiff? Okay, so if we head into a world of Bitcoin winning, what do we lose by not having fiat money, government money, whether that's as we have it now or CBDC? We know governments have levers to help with the economy. Some Bitcoiners will be like, we don't care. I don't care. But you as somebody who's a macroeconomics analyst, is there anything you think we lose that we might miss?
It's hard. So these types of changes, I think it's easy to overestimate what they can do in a couple years, but then underestimate what they can do in the longer term. And so that's the part that's really hard to fully grasp. It could, for example, change the optimal size of a nation state. So if money's more portable inherently, that kind of opens up the competition between different countries, right? So, before, if it's harder to transfer your assets, there's more frictions. That means the jurisdiction has a little bit more control. If someone can take the vast majority of their assets with them easily, then it's like it kind of opens up jurisdictions as like you can shop for jurisdictions. And one implication of that is that's something that's really accessible to the rich more so than the middle class or the poor. And so it kind of that's something that really does advantage you if you're kind of privileged in some ways. And so I think that's going to be interesting implications longer term. That might be something that if you can get brain drain out of certain areas that are struggling, where the people that have the resources, that have the skills can get out, and it makes it hard for that area to recover, right? But it's hard to predict long term what that means. And I think it's one of those things that it changes. I think this is like a phase transition. So it's not something that just happens overnight. So I think it could change governance and things in some ways, but I think they're hard to foresee.
And it could be, we could go through a period of time where we have a government digital money alongside Bitcoin, and maybe some countries will launch a CBDC. I'm still not sure it'll happen here in the US. I'm not 100% sure in the UK. I know it exists in China. I know other countries are trying. Who knows? But while we wait for Bitcoin to win, or while the race is happening, these other currencies will exist. So somebody listen to this, Lyn, they're still going to have to consider the relationship between what they hold in terms of, say, fiat and what they hold in terms of Bitcoin. Now, you've talked about developed markets seeing currency collapses. We've raised Venezuela today. We've talked about Lebanon. We've talked about Turkey. There's Argentina. There's plenty of other countries that are seeing high inflation and seeing currency collapses. But for the first time in my life, I feel like my domestic currency, the pound, is at risk of very high inflation. There's lots of weird things happening. The same here in the US. So just for somebody listening who might not understand, what is the kind of like worst and best case scenario that you're planning for with regards to what's happening with the dollar?
I use the 40s as a lot of a kind of description of what's happening now. And that was pre-war, right? So now it actually got closer, unfortunately, to that comparison, because now we're adding additional kinetic war to the mix. But essentially, the last time that the developed world was as indebted as it is now on the sovereign level was the 1940s. And that was a result of all the imbalances during that period and then the large wars. And the way that was largely handled was massive currency devaluation, right? So interest rates would be held low because if you have 100% or 150% debt to GDP, you can't pay 10% interest rates on that. That's how you spiral into bankruptcy. So they just hold rates low, even if inflation's double digits. And that doesn't mean interest rates can't go up, but if you go up from 1% to 0% to 3%, while inflation's 8% or 12% or whatever the number is, that you're still getting devalued. Your share of that network is being diluted over time. My concern is that as we enter an environment of scarcer commodities, as we enter an environment of even just partial deglobalization, so just the lack of continuing of globalization, maybe hold on to the globalization we have, maybe claw it back to some degree, all of those adds friction and inflationary forces to the system. And so I think we have a lot more kind of inherently inflationary forces in the real stuff that we need to consume at the same time as the money system, the amount of the monetary inflation, so the number of new units being created, the percent increase per year is above average. Interest rates are super low, and because of the debt, they have trouble raising them. That's a recipe for ongoing currency devaluation, and then throughout the world, that can result in kind of massive political revolutions, protests.
Well, we're seeing this right now. I mean, was
exactly.
it Peru I just saw last week? Protests. We've seen protests in Turkey. But we're seeing, it feels like this is a growing issue.
Yeah. And I think that generally whenever you have food prices spike and you have fuel prices spike, and especially when it happens faster than wages can adjust, because those things can happen over the course of a month, whereas it's not like everyone's wages just automatically tick up to match that during that month. That's when you get these massive protests because people can't put food on their table. They can't, power their car, their motorcycle, whatever the case may be. They just can't do the things they have to do in order to function in life. And that's when they hit their last straw and they go out and protest, and it can get pretty violent. And so that's the challenge of these decades of commodity scarcity and these decades of big monetary transitions. And there's no silver bullet. There's not something that someone can do to entirely eliminate risk. And there's going to be people that are really negatively impacted by this. But the way that people can protect themselves is by doing a careful assessment of where they're storing their assets. So are they storing their assets in things that can be devalued beyond, obviously you need some working capital, or at least most people, unless you're super tech savvy, you kind of optimize it to see, be on your own kind of like Bitcoin standard or something. But if, for vast majority of people, you need working capital, you need some kind of low volatility money for incoming spending, things like that. But your actual kind of reserve, to the extent that you can have them, you want to be very selective with what you own. And you want to look at things like scarcity. Can it grow long-term? What's its value? What's the value of this thing going to be like 5-10 years from now, most likely relative to other things? And then also, depending on where they are in the world, is it something they can self-custody or not? And that's actually, that's one of the rare aspects of money, is that unlike, I can't self-custody an equity. I'm on someone else's ledger if I own an equity. Same thing with a bond. Real estate's obviously it's not portable. And so there's actually very few things that you can hold it and it's a bare asset that just you hold it outside of the system. There's no counterparty risk. And, gold has traditionally filled that role where someone can have a small amount of gold and it's just theirs. It's an asset that is not someone else's liability. So equities are technically liabilities of the company. Bonds are obviously liabilities. Currencies are liabilities of the central bank. All of these assets are some other entity's liability, except for these like fundamental bare assets, things like gold. And then now, over the past 13 years, we have Bitcoin, and it's more portable. You can transfer it with you pretty much wherever you go. You can use it for censorship resistant payments if you need to. It has a variety of use cases. And so I think in addition to being an investment, in addition to being savings, it's also insurance. It gives you kind of that optionality in a way that other assets don't.